I never imagined my life would take such a drastic turn, but here I am, recounting the story of what was supposed to be my wedding day. My name is Ian, I'm 28, and last week I was supposed to marry my fiancée, April, who's 26. We'd been together for 3 years, a relationship that started through mutual friends. Despite our differences, we clicked instantly. A year into dating, she moved in with me and everything seemed to fall into place as our relationship became more serious. As time went on, we discussed our future extensively. Marriage, kids, the whole package. We decided we wanted to marry before turning 30 and agreed on starting a family soon after. April shared her desire to become a stay-at-home mom once we had kids, and I fully supported her decision. I work in tech and earn a solid income, so I believed I could support our family comfortably. Until then, April planned to continue working, allowing us to save and prepare for the life we envisioned together. But everything fell apart. Just days before the wedding, out of nowhere, April handed me a contract, a legally binding document she wanted me to sign. The terms? I would be required to transfer 40% of my income to her account every month after our wedding. She framed it as a financial security for her future. But what shook me wasn't the idea of financial planning. It was the way she presented it, last minute, with no prior discussion. The timing felt deliberate, like she'd waited until I was too preoccupied to question her. The sneaky delivery rattled me more than the contract itself. She'd had almost a year since our engagement to discuss this with me, and instead she sprung it on me the day before our wedding. I felt blindsided. Her mother, Donna, was the one who actually delivered the contract to me. When she walked into my apartment holding that document, I thought it was some kind of joke, but it wasn't. Donna calmly explained the terms as if it were a minor adjustment to our wedding plans. Dumbfounded, I asked to speak directly with April. That conversation was the beginning of the end. April admitted the contract was her idea. She explained that she'd been mulling it over for months but didn't know how to bring it up. Now, just hours before our wedding, she wanted me to sign. Her reasoning? She wanted assurance of financial stability before committing to our marriage. I tried to remain calm, but her actions screamed mistrust. Why legalize something we could have discussed and agreed upon together? Why now, when everything was already set in motion? I told her that 40% of my income was excessive, especially since she wouldn't be leaving her job until after we had kids, but April wouldn't budge. She insisted that if I didn't sign, there would be no wedding. Her ultimatum left me reeling. How had we reached this point? Where was the trust we'd built over 3 years? Still, I didn't want to make a rash decision. I pretended to agree, signing the contract without protest and returning to my room, seething with anger and betrayal. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. April and Donna had played me, and I wasn't about to let them get away with it. The next morning, everything proceeded as planned until we reached the altar. April recited her vows, and when it was my turn, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the contract instead. I read the terms aloud, my voice steady but full of emotion. The room fell silent. Guests looked confused, and April's face turned crimson as I explained the situation. I told everyone present that I couldn't marry someone who didn't trust me enough to discuss something so important openly. I tore the contract into pieces, let them flutter to the ground, and walked out. I didn't look back. My car was packed, and I drove to a hotel where I've been staying ever since. It was dramatic, sure, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to reclaim my dignity. Both our families were furious. They accused me of ruining the wedding and humiliating April. They said I should have handled it privately, but how could I, when she'd betrayed my trust so blatantly? Now I'm left questioning if what I did was right. Should I have walked away quietly? Or did April and Donna deserve what they got? After walking out of the wedding, I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours. My phone was blowing up with calls and messages from both our families, but I ignored them all. I couldn't face anyone. The mix of anger, disappointment, and regret swirling in my chest was suffocating. I eventually found a quiet hotel a couple of towns over and checked in, hoping to disappear for a while and figure out what to do next. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying everything, the contract, the confrontation, April's expression when I read it aloud at the altar. Part of me felt vindicated. I had stood up for myself and refused to be manipulated. But another part of me questioned if I'd gone too far. Did I really need to embarrass her like that in front of everyone? Could I have handled it differently? The next day, I finally caved and called my parents. I needed to let them know I was safe, but I wasn't ready for the lecture that came with it. My mom was furious. She said I disrespected April and her family, and that my actions had humiliated not just her, but our entire family. According to her, I could have quietly called off the wedding instead of turning it into a public spectacle. My dad chimed in too, saying my behavior was immature and impulsive. I tried to explain my side. I told them how blindsided I felt by the contract and how sneaky April had been. I reminded them that I had been nothing but supportive of her plans to be a stay-at-home mom, but the way she went about this crossed a line for me. They listened but didn't seem convinced. My mom said something that stuck with me. "You've made a mockery of this relationship. Whether or not she was wrong, you chose the nuclear option. Now, everyone will remember this wedding for the disaster it became." I hung up feeling worse than before. Even though I still believed I was justified, the weight of their disappointment made me doubt myself. Over the next few days, the texts and calls didn't stop. April's parents were relentless. They demanded I apologize to their daughter and issue a public statement explaining my behavior. They even suggested I lie and say I was struggling with mental health issues, which infuriated me. How could they not see how manipulative April's actions were? To them, I was the villain, and April was the victim. No one wanted to talk about the contract or why I felt betrayed. Meanwhile, April herself didn't reach out. Not a single word. I wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Part of me was relieved because I didn't know how to face her yet, but another part of me was hurt. After 3 years together, she didn't even want to talk about what had happened. It felt like confirmation that I had been nothing more than a means to an end for her, a paycheck to secure her future. The silence between us was deafening. I thought back to all the moments we'd shared, the plans we'd made, and the life we'd envisioned together. I had loved April deeply, and I thought she loved me too. But how could someone who loved me pull a stunt like this? How could she throw away everything we had for a legal document she didn't even have the decency to discuss with me in advance? I started replaying the argument we'd had the night before the wedding. I remembered the way she dismissed my concerns, brushing off my questions as if I was overreacting. "It's just a piece of paper, Ian," she'd said. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. It wasn't about the money. It was about trust, or the lack of it. If she couldn't trust me to support her without a contract, how could I trust her to be my partner for life? Every time I thought about it, I got angrier. At April, at Donna, at myself. I hated that I still cared, and that I couldn't just let go and move on. But 3 years of memories don't disappear overnight, no matter how much I wish they would. By the end of the week, I was emotionally drained. The initial rush of anger had subsided, leaving behind an ache I couldn't shake. I missed April, even though I knew I shouldn't. I missed the life we were supposed to have, even though I knew it wasn't real anymore. And as much as I tried to convince myself that I didn't care what people thought, the weight of everyone's judgment was starting to get to me. I wasn't ready to face the world yet, but I also knew I couldn't hide in a hotel forever. It was time to go home. I packed my bags, checked out of the hotel, and drove back to the apartment April and I had shared. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there, but I needed to start picking up the pieces of my life, one way or another. When I walked through the door, the first thing I noticed was how empty it felt. April had moved out. Her things were gone, her clothes, her books, even the little decorations she'd added to make the place feel more like home. She hadn't said a word to me about leaving, but in a way, I was grateful. I didn't have the energy for another confrontation. At least now I could start fresh, even if the apartment felt more like a reminder of what I'd lost than a place to rebuild. I sat on the couch surrounded by silence, and finally let myself cry. For everything. For the love that had turned into betrayal. For the future that would never be. For the man I thought I was but wasn't anymore. And when the tears finally stopped, I took a deep breath and decided it was time to move forward, no matter how long it took. After settling back into my apartment, I tried to focus on putting my life back together. Easier said than done. The place felt different without April's presence, almost hollow. Every corner of the apartment held memories of her, us cooking together, laughing at dumb TV shows, even the occasional argument. Now, it felt like I was living in someone else's space, not my own. But at least it was quiet, and I had the space to process everything. The first few days were rough. I avoided checking my phone because I didn't want to deal with the flood of messages from friends, family, or April's parents. They'd been relentless ever since the wedding, calling me selfish, petty, and worse. The guilt from their words gnawed at me, even though I knew I'd acted out of hurt. But guilt and justification can coexist, and both were living rent-free in my head. I knew I couldn't avoid everyone forever. I finally mustered the courage to call my parents again. This time, the conversation went a little differently. I started by explaining my side of the story, not as an excuse but as a way to help them understand where I was coming from. I told them how betrayed I'd felt and how the contract made me question everything about my relationship with April. As I talked, I felt a lump rise in my throat, and before I knew it, I was crying. That caught them off guard. My parents had been so caught up in the drama and damage control that they hadn't really considered how I was feeling. When they realized how broken I was, their tone softened. My mom, who'd been the most critical of my actions, apologized for being so hard on me. My dad admitted that while he still thought I'd handled things poorly, he understood why I'd done it. That was enough for now. We ended the call on a better note, and I felt a little less alone. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel like the entire world was against me. My parents and I weren't fully on the same page yet, but at least we weren't fighting anymore. That was a step in the right direction. With my family somewhat back on my side, I decided to start reaching out to friends. I was hesitant at first. I wasn't ready to hear their opinions about the wedding debacle, but to my surprise, they were overwhelmingly supportive. Most of them said they would have done the same thing in my position, and a few even applauded me for standing up for myself. That validation meant more to me than I expected. It didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me feel less isolated. One evening, I got a call from a close friend, Kyle. He'd been at the wedding and witnessed the whole thing. Kyle wasn't the type to sugarcoat things, so I braced myself for what he might say. To my relief, he wasn't calling to criticize me. Instead, he told me he was proud of me for not letting April or her family manipulate me. He said, "Look, man, it was messy as hell, but sometimes life is messy. You did what you had to do, and anyone who doesn't get that can screw off." Hearing that from Kyle, someone whose opinion I truly valued, was like a weight off my shoulders. It reminded me that I wasn't the villain in this story, no matter how much April's parents tried to paint me as one. Speaking of April's parents, they weren't letting up. They started showing up unannounced at my apartment, demanding that I repay them for their share of the wedding expenses. According to them, since I'd ruined everything, it was my responsibility to make them whole. Their audacity was staggering. I didn't owe them anything, and I made that very clear. One day, after yet another confrontation with them, I lost my temper. I stepped outside, looked them dead in the eye, and told them exactly what I thought. I told them their daughter's actions were deceptive and manipulative, and that they had no right to demand anything from me. I said if they wanted to talk about ruined lives and egos, they should take a long, hard look in the mirror. They left in a huff, and I slammed the door, feeling both exhausted and relieved. Later that night, I called April. I didn't want to, but I felt like I had to. I needed to know if she was behind her parents' behavior or if they were acting on their own. After several missed calls, she finally picked up, sounding irritated. I told her what her parents had been doing, and her tone immediately changed. She apologized, saying she had no idea they'd been harassing me. Apparently, she'd already told them to leave me alone, but they hadn't listened. April sounded genuinely upset, and for a moment, I almost forgot why we weren't together anymore. We ended the call amicably, but it stirred up a lot of emotions for me. Hearing her voice again brought back memories of the good times we'd shared, and it hurt to think about how everything had fallen apart. Despite the brief moment of connection, I knew I couldn't dwell on April or what could have been. Our relationship was over, and I needed to move forward. To do that, I started making plans for my future. I'd been toying with the idea of starting my own business for years, and now felt like the right time. If nothing else, it would give me something to focus on, something to look forward to. I called my dad to pitch the idea, and to my surprise, he was supportive. He even offered to help me with the initial investment. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful about something. It was a small spark, but it was enough to keep me going. The road ahead still felt uncertain, but I was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Baby steps, I reminded myself. One day at a time. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly started to stabilize. The chaos surrounding the wedding began to fade, and people stopped asking questions. For the most part, I avoided the topic altogether. My family had stopped pushing me to apologize publicly, and April's parents hadn't shown up at my door since our last confrontation. The quiet was welcome, even if it felt a little eerie at times. I threw myself into planning my business. It became my escape, a way to channel my energy and distract myself from the lingering ache of what had happened. My dad was surprisingly hands-on, helping me sort through logistics and connect with people in his network. It felt good to rebuild our relationship, especially after the tension following the wedding. We didn't talk about April or the fiasco anymore, which was a relief. It was nice to focus on something constructive instead of rehashing the past. But the past has a way of sneaking up on you when you least expect it. One evening, I was out at a bar with a couple of friends, finally starting to feel like myself again. We were catching up, joking around, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about April. Then I saw her. She was sitting at a table across the room, laughing with some guy. My stomach dropped. For a split second, I thought about leaving. The sight of her brought back all the emotions I'd been trying so hard to bury. But I stayed. I didn't want to make a scene. And honestly, I wasn't even sure she'd noticed me. As the night went on, my friends picked up on my distraction. Kyle, ever the blunt one, leaned over and whispered, "You good, man? You've been staring at that table for 20 minutes. I shook it off, but inside, I was a mess. Seeing her with someone else felt like a punch to the gut, even though I knew I had no right to feel that way. We were done. She had every right to move on, just as I was trying to do. Still, the thought of her being happy with someone else stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. Before I could slip out unnoticed, April spotted me. She walked over, leaving the guy she was with at the table. My heart raced as she approached, but I forced myself to stay calm. She didn't look angry or upset, just nervous. "Hey, Ian," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Can we talk?" she asked, glancing back at her table. The guy was gone, which I hadn't even noticed. For a moment, I wondered if he was her date, but she quickly explained that he was just a family friend passing through town. Relieved, but still guarded, I followed her to a quieter corner of the bar. For the first time since the wedding, we had an actual conversation. No accusations, no yelling, just two people trying to make sense of the wreckage they'd left behind. April started by apologizing. She admitted she'd been wrong to spring the contract on me the way she had. She said she'd been overwhelmed by fear about the future and had let that fear cloud her judgment. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "But now I see how much I hurt you, and I'm so sorry." Hearing her say those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For months, I'd been carrying the hurt and betrayal, wondering if she even cared about what she'd done. Now, I finally had my answer. I told her how her actions had made me feel, how the contract wasn't about money but about trust, and how her lack of openness had shattered the foundation of our relationship. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and admitted she should have handled things differently. She also confessed that her mother, Donna, had pushed her to present the contract that way, convincing her it was just a formality. We talked for what felt like hours, hashing out everything we hadn't said since the wedding. By the end of it, we both agreed that while we had loved each other deeply, the trust between us had been irreparably damaged. There was no going back, not as lovers and not even as friends. But there was closure, and that was enough. We said goodbye that night, and this time it felt final. I walked back to my friends feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. The chapter with April was officially closed, and while it hurt, it also felt like a step toward healing. In the days that followed, I threw myself even harder into my business. With April out of my mind, I finally had the clarity to focus on building something meaningful. My dad and I finalized our plans, and I started laying the groundwork for what would hopefully be a successful venture. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of looking back. Life wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. Slowly but surely, I was picking up the pieces and finding my way. The wedding might have been a disaster, but it didn't define me. I was ready to start a new chapter, one that was all my own. 3 months after the wedding that never was, my life finally felt like it was gaining momentum again. The business I'd been working on was coming together piece by piece. Long days were spent making calls, drafting plans, and troubleshooting the countless challenges that came with starting something new. It wasn't easy, but it gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. My dad had been a constant source of support. He didn't just invest in the business, he also gave me advice I never realized I needed. For years, I'd seen him as someone who didn't quite understand me, but working alongside him gave me a new perspective. We didn't talk about the wedding anymore. It was like an unspoken agreement between us to leave it in the past. I appreciated that. I was done letting my life be defined by what happened that day. Speaking of the past, April had faded into the background of my thoughts. After our talk at the bar, I found it easier to let go. Hearing her acknowledge her mistakes and apologize had been healing in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't hate her. In fact, I wished her well. But I was certain now that we were better off apart. One day, while I was at home sorting through some paperwork, my phone buzzed with a message from Kyle. "Bar tonight? You've been MIA for weeks. Time to rejoin society." I smiled. Kyle was the kind of friend who didn't let you wallow for too long. I hadn't been avoiding people intentionally, but between work and the emotional toll of everything, socializing had taken a back seat. I figured it was time to change that. Later that evening, I met up with Kyle and a few others at a local spot. The atmosphere was lively, the drinks were flowing, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. It wasn't the kind of happiness that came from ignoring pain. It was the kind that came from realizing you were finally moving past it. At some point during the night, Kyle leaned over and said, "You're looking better, man. Like, really better." "Thanks," I replied, laughing. "It's amazing what a little time and a lot of work can do." We clinked glasses, and for the first time I believed my own words. I was getting better, not just pretending to be . The next few weeks flew by. My business was gaining traction, and I was busier than ever. I reconnected with old friends, started working out again, and even picked up some hobbies I'd neglected over the years. Life wasn't perfect, it never is, but it felt good. It felt mine. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a call with a potential client, my mom called. Her tone was lighter than it had been in months. She asked how I was doing, how the business was going, and for the first time didn't bring up the wedding at all. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. Before hanging up, she said, "I'm proud of you, Ian. You've handled all of this better than I think I could have." That stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt like I was letting everyone down, my family, my friends, even myself. Hearing her say those words reminded me how far I'd come. As the months rolled on, I realized something. The wedding disaster wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one. It forced me to reevaluate my priorities, my relationships, and most importantly, myself. I learned how to stand up for what I believed in, even when it was messy. I learned that trust and communication aren't optional in a relationship. They're the foundation. And I learned that sometimes walking away isn't giving up. It's making space for something better. April and I haven't spoken since that night at the bar, and I'm okay with that. Closure doesn't always mean staying in each other's lives. Sometimes it just means letting go. Looking back, I don't regret what happened. It was painful, yes. Embarrassing, absolutely. But it was also necessary. It taught me more about myself than I ever wanted to know, and for that, I'm grateful. Now, I'm focused on the road ahead. My business is set to launch in a few months, and I'm excited about the possibilities. I've started thinking about dating again. Not right away, but eventually. I want to build a life with someone who shares my values, someone I can trust completely. But for now, I'm content with where I am. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that life doesn't go according to plan. And that's okay. Because sometimes the best stories come from the moments we never saw coming.